Okay, let's open our Bibles and let's go to the Gospel of John, the second chapter, as we continue our verse-by-verse chronological study through the Gospels. We're in exciting times now. We're seeing the ministry of Christ in the forefront. The ministry of John the Baptist has faded. The ministry of Christ has come into the spotlight, and as you can see on the screen behind me, today we're going to be focusing on chapter 2, verses 13 through 17, and we are going to see the first temple cleansing by Jesus. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard people try to describe Jesus. There are some people that describe Jesus as someone who was always happy, someone who never got upset, someone who, no matter what people would do, he would simply put his head down, smile, and say, "I love you." Now, it's true that Jesus did love people and does love people. It is true that Jesus was extremely patient with people and is extremely patient with people. It's true that Jesus was gentle and humble in heart. But it is not true when people say Jesus never got upset. Oh, no. In the Gospels, we see Jesus getting upset many times. Jesus got upset when he saw irreverent worship. Jesus got upset when he saw his Father's house not being treated as holy. Jesus got upset when religious leaders turned what was supposed to be worship towards God into some sort of business and marketplace for man. Oh yeah, Jesus got upset. In fact, we're going to see that today as we study the first temple cleansing by Jesus, which means he also did a second temple cleansing. The first one we're going to study today, that's the beginning of his earthly ministry. The second one, right at the end before he went to the cross. Things didn't change from the first temple cleansing. And that's why he had to do the second temple cleansing. Now, just to give us a reminder here, if you remember the background, last week we saw Jesus' earthly ministry really starting to come into the spotlight. After he had saved his first 6 disciples, remember we saw last week how they went to a wedding in Cana, which was maybe 8 to 10 miles north of Nazareth. And it was there that Jesus performed his first miraculous sign, showing that he is the source of life, changing water into wine. That was in where? Cana. Again, watch me. You have Galilee, you have Samaria, you have Judea. There in Galilee, you had Nazareth, and about 8 to 10 miles north of that was Cana. That's where Jesus performed his first miraculous sign. Where did Jesus perform his second miraculous sign? Cana. We're going to see that in a few weeks from now. When he returned back up to Galilee and Cana, we're going to see how he healed a royal official's son. Thus, Jesus performing his second miraculous sign in Cana, Galilee. But before we get to this second miraculous sign, Jesus is going to go on a journey. We're going to see today that he left Cana and he made his way down south to Jerusalem. Why? Because it was the Passover. And we're going to see how Jesus cleansed the temple during that Passover time there in Jerusalem, Judea. And then next week, or maybe 2 weeks from now, we're going to stay in Jerusalem, and we're going to see Jesus have a conversation with Nicodemus, saying, hey, and again, Nicodemus, Israel's teacher, big teacher, saying to him, you don't know what's going on. You're Israel's teacher, and you don't understand that you must be born again? to be able to enter the kingdom of God? We're then going to see Jesus from this conversation turn north. And he's going to see John the Baptist. Their ministries are going to intersect for a brief moment in the rural area of Judea. And we're going to see John the Baptist's final testimony, at least in John's gospel, about Jesus Christ. Again, Jesus now is heading back north to come to Galilee and Cana in Galilee. But before he gets to Galilee, after leaving Judea, what was between Judea and Galilee? Samaria. And we're going to see Jesus save a Samaritan woman. And not just her, but we're going to see him save many people in that Samaritan village before he ends up there in Cana. Do you understand the journey we're going to be on over these next several weeks? From Galilee down to Judea, turning back north, going through Samaria, ending back up in Galilee, second miraculous sign in Cana. So today, we're seeing Jesus leave Cana, and we're going to see him now down in Jerusalem in the first temple cleansing. Let's read our text for today. Chapter 2, starting in verse 13, we see that when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords, and he drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." That's going to be our text for today. And if you're taking note, we're going to take a look at 3 P's, okay? P number 1, we're going to look at the Passover. Again, Jesus was in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover. Verse 13, what was the big deal about the Passover? Why did Jesus have to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover? We're going to see the problem that happened during the Passover there in the temple courts. Verse 14, Jesus getting a little bit upset, which leads to verses 15 through 17, what he ended up doing in the temple courts, the purification. And then we're going to see what this all has to do with us. I think we're going to learn a lot on this one. So let's take a look at our first P, the Passover, in verse 13. We're told, again, this was right after Jesus had performed his first miraculous sign there in Cana. He and his mother and his brothers and disciples, they left, they went down to Capernaum, and eventually ended up in Jerusalem. Verse 13, when it was almost time for the Jewish what? Passover. I would underline that. Key word. Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Watch. Again, he actually went south, but Jerusalem was elevated, so that's why when we read in the Gospels, he went up to Jerusalem. He didn't actually go north, okay? He was going south, but Jerusalem was elevated, okay? So, it was almost time for the Jewish Passover. Jesus went to Jerusalem. Okay, so we understand why Jesus went to Jerusalem, right? Celebrate the Passover. Here's the question. Why did Jesus have to celebrate the Passover? Well, number 1, we know he had already said that he came to fulfill all what? Righteousness, right? He came not to break the law of God, but to fulfill it in the place of us lawbreakers, and then to eventually go to the cross and pay for our lawlessness. But why did Jesus go to Jerusalem during the Passover? What was the big deal? Well, let's do this. Let's go to Exodus. I'm going to show you 3 things. Exodus chapter 12. Let's see what God had to say to his people about the Passover. Now again, we studied this, I guess, probably a few weeks ago. I'm going to review it, but I'm going to kind of put a different focus on it that hopefully will help you understand something. You guys know the story. God's people were in bondage there in Egypt for over 400 years. God raised up a deliverer. His name was Moses. Moses went to the big shot there in Egypt, Pharaoh, and said, hey, my God says you've got to let his people free. Well, Pharaoh wouldn't do it. God brought 9 plagues upon Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and then he brought the final and big-time plague, the 10th one, which was the Lord's Passover. Let's read it, chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. That would be March, April, okay? Here was God's command. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, key, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood, put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. That same night, they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you're to eat it. With your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. God then said, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will, i.e. God's wrath, pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. You know the story. The Israelites were going to be set free from the bondage of Egypt. How? They were to take a year-old animal without blemish, bring it into their home on the 10th day of the month, right? March or April. They were to keep it for 4 days. On the 14th day, they were all to slaughter the animals. The idea that the blood then would be rubbed over the door frames of the Israelites. The animal died in the place of the Israelites. The blood covered them, and therefore God's wrath would not come upon them. When he saw the blood, he would pass over them. But any house that did not have the blood, i.e. like the Egyptians, God's wrath came on them. And we know exactly that's what happened. Hop over to verse 29. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. During the night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you've requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go, and also bless me. This is how the Lord's people were set free from the bondage in Egypt. And you know this story, right? But did you know that God gave his people a command before he set them free? Go back to verse 14. God said, this is a day. Which day? Passover. That God said you are to commemorate, to celebrate every year. And you are to do this for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. So God gave a command to his people. The Passover was to be celebrated annually. Why did Jesus go to Jerusalem? To celebrate the what? Passover. Because he was fulfilling the law. And how is it that the Jews each and every year celebrated the Passover? Well, again, we look at some key words. Verse 3, on the 10th day of the month, they would all gather a lamb. This lamb, verse 5, was to be without defect. Verse 6, they would take care of the lamb until the 14th day of the month. And then the end of verse 6, they would all, together as a community, slaughter the lambs at twilight. This was a remembrance of what God did for their forefathers when they were in bondage in Egypt. And what would happen would be this. The Passover, again, the people would have their lambs, their animals, and then it would be somewhere between 3 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. That's when the animals would be slaughtered. Can you imagine how loud that noise was in Jerusalem? Could you imagine the smell of all that blood in Jerusalem? What would then happen? There would be a Passover meal where families would gather in their homes after the slaughtering of the lambs. And there would be a Passover meal. And here are the following elements. Number 1, there would be a prayer of thanksgiving by the head of the household. And then the drinking of the first cup. Number 2, they would then eat bitter herbs as a reminder of their bitter slavery in Egypt. You're underlining some words, aren't you, Owen? Good, because you can see the connection. Number 3, one of the sons would then ask, why is this night, talking about the Passover, different from all the other nights? Then the father would either tell the story of the Exodus or actually read the story of the Exodus that we just read. Number 4, they would then sing a song. It was called the Hallel, Psalm 113 and Psalm 114. And then they would wash their hands. Number 5, they would then carve and eat the lamb together with the unleavened bread, which symbolized the fact that the Jews had to leave Egypt in a hurry, in haste. Then they would continue the meal, number 6. And then number 7, they would sing one last song, the Hallel, but this time Psalms 115 to 118. And the Passover actually was not just one day. It was connected to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So there was the one-day Passover where they slaughtered the animals and celebrated the Passover meal. But then they would extend it an additional 7 days, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So by the time we read in the New Testament, we see that the Passover was commonly one word describing not just the one day, but the one day plus the 7 days. What was the key to celebrating the Passover? Look, animal sacrifices were required. Would you guys agree with that? Okay, good. You know what else was key? All Jewish males were required to celebrate the Passover. Jewish males 12 years of age and above. How do we know that? Just stay in Exodus, go to chapter 23. We see here in Exodus 23, God giving another command. Verse 14, 3 times a year, God was saying to his people, you are to celebrate a festival to me. There were 3 annual festivals that God said had to be celebrated. The first one, verse 15, celebrate the festival of unleavened bread. For 7 days, eat bread made without yeast as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time of the month, Aviv, March or April. For in that month you came out of Egypt. Another festival, God said, no one is to appear before me, what? Empty-handed. What was required? Animal sacrifices. They also were to celebrate the Feast of Harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in the field. That's Pentecost. They also were to celebrate the Festival of Ingathering, or booths or tabernacles, at the end of the year when you gather in the crops from the field. Look what God said. 3 times a year for these 3 festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. God said these 3 festivals, 3 times a year. What are the next 3 words? All the men, all Jewish men were required to go where God would set up his house, his holy house, and they were required to celebrate these 3 feasts. And God said, do not offer blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. And God was warning them, don't fall into the pagan practice. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk. So do you see the Passover? Why did Jesus go to the Passover? It was commanded by God. Number 2, Jesus was a Jewish what? Male. And there was something else about the Passover. Not only were animal sacrifices required, not only were all Jewish males required to go, temple taxes were required to be paid. Go over to chapter 30, and then we will return back to John. Chapter 30, we see God giving another command. Starting in verse 11, the Lord said to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. Each one, talking about Israelites who cross over to the promised land, they are to give a half shekel according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs. This half shekel is an offering to the Lord. It was a temple tax. Who was required to pay this? Well, all who cross over, those 20 years old or more, are to give that offering to the Lord. The rich are not to give more than a half a shekel. The poor are not to give less when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives. Receive the atonement money from the Israelites. Use it for the service of the tent of the meeting, tabernacle, or temple. It will be a memorial for the Israelites before the Lord, making atonement for your lives. Do you understand what was required? For the Passover, animal sacrifices. For the Passover, that was one of the 3 major festivals. All Jewish males were required to go. And they also had to pay a temple tax. Remember, back then, when God brought his people into the promised land, Israel was a theocracy. It was a nation under God. And basically, the temple tax was paid by Jewish males for the upkeep of the temple, to help the poor, and to take care of God's house. Well, that continued all the way to the time of Jesus, which now helps us get into the big part of our story, the problem. Go back to John chapter 2. And guys, I know I belabored the point a little bit on the Passover, but I think you're going to see why. John chapter 2, we understand now, right? The Passover, okay? And we see in verse 13, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus, right, Jewish male, went to Jerusalem. But look at the problem he found. Verse 14. In the temple courts, which probably would have been the court of the Gentiles, in the temple courts, what did Jesus find? People worshiping the Lord, people praying prayers to the Lord. Is that what Jesus found there? Mario, what did Jesus find there? Oh, I see what he found there. People, what's that S word? Selling, underline selling. Selling cattle, sheep, and doves. Can you think of any reason why they would be doing that? But not only that, others were sitting at tables and exchanging what? Money. I would underline money. Can you think of any reason why they might be doing that? Oh, yes, you can. Because remember what we learned about the Passover. What was required? Animal what? Sacrifices. Look at these guys. They said, hey, we've got animals for you. You can just buy them from us. Because remember, males had to come from everywhere. to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem? People came from long distances. I mean, Jesus and his disciples came from Nazareth, Galilee, Cana. That's a long distance to carry an animal. So, it made sense that there were people there who said, okay, animal sacrifices are required for the Passover. We've got animals here for you. Another thing that kind of made sense is you had these tables where people were sitting exchanging money. Why? Because the Jews believed that either Jewish coins or Tyrrhenian coins were the only coins acceptable as offerings to pay which tax? Temple tax. Were the only coins acceptable there in the temple because they believed that those coins, the silver was pure. Only those coins could be used. Well, you had people coming from all over the place, right? Well, they didn't have those exact coins in those areas they lived. So now all of a sudden you had all these Jewish males, and they were required to come, but many of them brought their families as well, right? So now you've got this massive crowd coming in. People are looking to buy animals because we know animals needed to be sacrificed. We know they had to have the exact correct type of coin to be able to pay the temple tax because we know temple tax was required. So look how some of these people in the temple courts were so nice. We've got animals for you. We can exchange your pagan money. We've got the exact correct coins. What was the big deal? I mean, it was needed, right? I mean, do we agree that animal sacrifices were needed? Do we agree it would be pretty hard to carry animals on your shoulder long distances? Do we agree that, okay, temple tax was required, specific coinage was required? Okay, it made sense. If you come from a different area that doesn't have that coinage, you need to exchange it. That makes sense, right? Yes, until you know the history. You know those people that were there with the animals and the money exchangers? They were charging extra fees as much as 12.5%. As commentator F.F. Bruce says. Do you understand what they were doing? Passover. A few people showed up in Jerusalem, or a lot of people? A lot of people, because it was one of the required festivals, right? Did the people have to have animals to sacrifice? Yes or no? Sure they did. It was God's law. Did the people have to pay the temple tax? Yes or no? Yes, it was God's law. So guess what? These opportunists here, they weren't stupid. They were entrepreneurs. Big crowds meant big business. And you know who ran the business? It was the mafia religious boss, Annas, and his son-in-law, Caiaphas. You guys know Caiaphas. You're going to read all about him, and Annas, the ones who were there to crucify Jesus. Annas, he served as high priest for about 6 years. He was about 9 years, from 6 AD to 15 AD. He was deposed by the Romans. But Annas wouldn't let go of that position because the high priest had the power in the temple. So Annas had 5 of his sons become high priests, even one of his grandsons. And then finally, he got the real thief to work with him, his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who, oh, by the way, was high priest from 18 AD to 36 AD. And the story we're reading right now by Jesus cleaning the first temple is around 27 AD. Jesus had to deal with the mafia religious leaders, Caiaphas, the son-in-law, and the man behind the scenes who was pulling all the strings, Annas. And they were thieves. And how do we know they were thieves? Look what Jesus said, just real quick. In verse 16, he said, you've turned my father's house into a what? A market. A business venture where they were selling things back and forth. Can you imagine the noise of the animals there? Can you imagine the noise of the money changers there? Who was praying there in the temple? Who was worshiping God there in the temple? It was a business. In fact, it was such a bad business. Go to Matthew chapter 21. Look what Jesus called their business when he cleansed the temple a second time. In verse 13, he said, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. Do you see how they were opportunists? People would come to Jerusalem, some who brought animals, let's say. They didn't come from a far distance. They would come up to the people who worked for Annas and Caiaphas there in the temple courts, and they were the inspectors of the animals, and they would look over the animals and say to, Mario, "No, Mario, your animal is not unblemished. I see a blemish there." "Where's the blemish?" "Maybe you picked it up on the way when you were bringing him here, but that animal cannot be sacrificed. And oh, by the way, Mario, you know God's law. You have to have an animal sacrifice." "What do I do? Oy vey." The inspector would say, "Look, we've got animals here for you." "Really?" "Yes. Pre-approved by the high priest. Pre-inspected. No problem." "No problem? Good. How much?" "This much." "Oh, okay. That much?" "Yeah." "Oh, and plus 12.5%. Cha-ching. Annas and Caiaphas understood big crowds meant big business. What about the money changers? All of a sudden, Joseph shows up and he's like, "I'm ready. I got to pay the temple tax because it's according to the law." And Joseph pulls out his coin. "Oh, no, the money inspectors who work for Caiaphas and Annas. Oh, no. These coins are not silver, pure silver, the way our coins are. Oy vey, what do I do?" "Well, you got to pay the temple tax because it's in Exodus, right? Guess what we have? Ching. We've got pre-approved, pre-inspected coins just for you." I sound like in a commercial, an infomercial, right? Joseph said, "Oh, thank you so much. I can worship the Lord. How much?" And they would say, "This much. Plus 12.5%. "What? Oh, yeah. You don't want to pay the temple tax? You want to disobey God? Dishonor God?" Do you see what they were doing? They were turning God's house, his holy temple, into a business, into a market, into a den of thieves. But didn't Jesus warn about that when it came to worship and money? Just hop over to chapter 6 real quick of Matthew. We looked at this when we were studying 1 Timothy. Look at verse 24. Jesus said, "No one can serve how many masters? 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be," what's that D word? Devoted, underline devoted, to the one. And what's the next D word? Despise, underline that word, the other. Jesus said you cannot serve both God and money. And Annas and Caiaphas thought they were above the law. They thought they could do it but they actually weren't trying to serve God. They were serving money. Why? Watch. Jesus said, if you try to serve God and money, here's what's going to happen. You're going to be devoted to one of them. The Greek word, anthexetai. You will hold firmly to and cling to one. And you will despise, the other D word, we learned this, remember? Kata phronese. You will think against, you will look down upon something. So here's the thing. Jesus says you can't serve both God and money. Because what you will do is you'll be devoted to one of them. You will cling to it, hold firmly to it. What were Annas and Caiaphas clinging to and holding firmly to? Money, not God. So they were devoted to money. And they despised. They thought against and they looked down on God. You can't serve both God and money, because eventually you're going to get devoted to one and you're going to despise the other. Jesus was not talking against money. He was not saying that there's something wrong with money, but you do not turn God's house into a market or a den of thieves. And oh, by the way, Satan doesn't care if you worship. He doesn't care if you worship. He doesn't care if you're religious. He just doesn't want you to be reverent towards God in your religion. He doesn't want you to be holy towards God in your religion. He had no problem with that den of thieves there in Jerusalem, because Satan knew that Annas and Caiaphas and those who worked for them were holding firmly to and clinging to money, and they were thinking against and looking down upon God. So what do you think happened when Jesus saw this problem? Oh, I know. He just put his head down and just said, I love you. You see, that's the wrong picture many people have of Jesus. Again, was Jesus patient with people? Absolutely. And he still is with us, right? Did Jesus put up with a lot when it came to people? Yeah, and he still does, even with us. But friends, Jesus would not put up with irreverence. He would not allow God's holy house to be unholy. And when he saw that, he took fast and furious action. Go back to John chapter 2. Again in verse 13, you understand the Passover. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, we know why Jesus went to Jerusalem, right? We know the problem. In the temple courts, Jesus found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money at exorbitant rates. So look at Jesus' response, the purification. Verse 15. So Jesus just put his head down and ignored them and left. You ever see those bracelets there a while ago? WWJW, what would Jesus do? Let me tell you what Jesus did. He would not allow his Father's house to be treated as a den of thieves. And look what he did. He made a whip out of cords. He probably took the rope, the animals that were there, probably tied up, waiting to be sold. He probably took some of that rope, made a whip out of it. And look what he did. He drove. The Greek word, it's very emphatic. He drove all talking animals and irreverent people there from the temple courts. He drove the sheep and the cattle. He then scattered the coins of the money changers. He overturned their tables. Can you imagine that scene right there? But he wasn't finished. How about the people with the doves? He said to those who sold the doves, "Get these out of here." Doves were probably in crates. "Get these crates out of here." Can you imagine this scene now, right? Big crowd, small crowd in Jerusalem for the Passover. Massive crowd, right? Temple courts, court of the Gentiles, where people were gathered, right? You've got the sound of animals. You've got the sound of the money exchanger. "Hey, come to me. Come to me. I'll give you a good deal." I mean, it was a business, right? Jesus shows up. He sees the problem, and he says, "Okay, I have a way of taking care of this irreverence, this unholiness. It's called purification." So how did Jesus clean the house? He made a whip of cords, right? He then drove all the animals. Now, how about this? Let's look at the animals. You've got cattle and sheep running everywhere. Think of the people screaming. Jesus turns over the tables of the money changers. Coins are flying everywhere. Tables are on the ground. People are screaming. Think of the money changers who loved money. They're probably diving on the floor to get their money. But how about the crowd of people there? They're going, "There's money there," right? Can you imagine that? Scripture doesn't tell us, so I'm just adding a little bit here, okay? This is my thinking, what maybe would have happened. The crowd of people, at least some of them, would have probably dove on the floor also. And now you've got people wrestling for money. You've got animals running everywhere. People screaming. Jesus with a cord of whips. People are going, "Who is this madman?" Remember, up to this point, nobody really knew who Jesus was. He had been up in Nazareth growing up. He then was baptized by John the Baptist. He immediately was led into the wilderness to battle Satan, right? After that, he went up north to Bethany, where John the Baptist was baptizing. Jesus saved his 6 disciples. They then went to a wedding in Cana. First miraculous sign. All of a sudden, he shows up in Jerusalem, and he looks like a terrorist in the temple. Think about this. Somebody walks in here right now with a whip and starts screaming and yelling and pounding that whip. Would you consider that person normal or a little abnormal? Right. What do you think maybe the people were thinking about Jesus? We're going to see next week. I mean, this was a huge statement he made. Like he showed up out of nowhere in people's minds. And all of a sudden, now, please, I know some of you who love animals like I do. That's why I did a lot of studying on this. Because I know the visual we have is he grabs his cord and just, he's whipping the animals. No. In fact, he wasn't even whipping the people. How do we know that? Right there in that temple area was the fort of Antonia. And this is where the Roman soldiers, think of a prison, okay? Think of outdoor court in the prison yard, where the prisoners are in the court. What is surrounding them all above? Towers and soldiers, right? Or police officers. Well, it's the same thing that court of Antonia, okay? The fort of Antonia. You had Roman soldiers surrounding it. So they look down and they see Jesus with his whip of cord. They see animals running everywhere. They see crates filled with doves being turned over, scattered all over the place, money everywhere, tables on the ground, people yelling and screaming. Yet we do not read that the Romans tried to stop it. The Romans, did they want to have a riot there or no riot? No riot. Because word would get back to Caesar. So the fact that we do not see any Roman intervention tells us, listen carefully, Jesus did not abuse the animals. He actually didn't abuse the people either. Because had he done so, we would have seen Roman intervention. Does that make sense? So he made a whip out of cords, drove all of them from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold the doves, he said, "Get these out of here." Stop turning, what are the next two words? My Father's, underline that, house. I would underline those three words, my Father's house, into a what? Market. And then verse 17, we read something. His disciples remembered that it is written, zeal for your house will what? Consume me. Guys, this was not an accident that happened there. What we see here are two things. Jesus, his passion for true reverence, zeal for the house of God consumed him. Was it a healthy passion or unhealthy passion? Healthy. And that passion, that zeal, led to the purification of that false religion. Was he right in doing the purification? Sure he was. And oh, by the way, in doing this, he fulfilled Old Testament prophecy about himself. Hop real quick to Psalm 69. King David, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, made this statement. Psalm 69, verse 9. For zeal for your house, what? Consumes me. That's what King David said. Now, obviously, in the immediate context, that's King David speaking, 1,000 years before Christ. But by connecting it, John the Gospel writer, connecting it to Jesus, we see here that this statement that King David had made 1,000 years earlier was a picture of what Christ would do and what his passion would be. That's why John the Gospel writer says the disciples remembered this quote in the Old Testament, zeal for your house consumes me. This was not an accident that Jesus just showed up in the temple courts and said, I cannot believe what I'm seeing. Another prophecy, go to Malachi. Right before Matthew, chapter 3. Malachi, last Old Testament prophet, writing prophet, where then God waited 400 years to again give prophecy to Zechariah, who would be the father of John the Baptist. So we see here Malachi, look what God said through Malachi. Chapter 3, verse 1, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me. Who was the messenger who came before the Messiah? John the Baptist. Then suddenly, the Lord, Jehovah, you are seeking, will come to his what? Temple. You think Jesus showing up in John chapter 2 was a bit sudden? A bit of a surprise? That was a prophecy. Then suddenly, the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant, i.e. new covenant, whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. But look at this, verse 2. Who can endure the day of his coming? He's not talking about his second coming. Which coming is he talking about here? His first coming, when he suddenly showed up where? In the temple. Who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? I'll tell you who couldn't stand. The money changers. I'll tell you who couldn't stand. All those people that are turning God's house into a market. For he, the Messiah, will be like a refiner's fire or a launderer's soap, purification. He will sit as a refiner and what? Purifier of silver. He will purify the Levites. You know, the false religion that was happening there. He's going to purify the Levites and refine them like gold and silver. Then the Lord will have men who will bring offerings in righteousness, not unrighteousness. And the offerings of Judah and Jerusalem will be acceptable to the Lord, as in days gone by, as in former years. Do you see that Jesus' first cleansing of the temple was talked about in the Old Testament. Back to John chapter 2. Verse 13, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords. And like the great refiner and great purifier predicted in Malachi 3, he drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold the doves, he said, get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market. And his disciples remembered what King David had said 1,000 years earlier under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. It is written, Psalm 69:9, zeal for your house will consume me. Do you understand what Jesus was doing here? Do you agree with this statement? Only God has the right to define true worship. Would you agree with that statement? What was Jesus doing when he cleansed the temple? Say it. He defined what true worship was. Because these people were religious. They were doing in the temple. Was it true worship of God? No, it was irreverence. Only God has the right to define true worship. Yes? Jesus is God who defines true worship. And oh, by the way, in case some of you might think that's a bit of a stretch, when Jesus said, stop turning my Father's house into a market, what was Jesus saying when he referred to God as my Father? Remember I taught you this. No Jew back then would ever refer to God as my Father. Never would they use that word my, that intimate word. No. And here comes Jesus saying, my Father, my Father, my Father. Do you understand that the Jews clearly understood what Jesus was saying there? He was saying, I am God, and I have the right to define true worship, and what you guys are doing is of the devil. And let's make sure we agree with that Jews would have understood when Jesus talked about my Father. Go to chapter 5, verses 16 through 18. Jesus healed somebody on the Sabbath. Well, the Jewish leaders didn't like that. So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, what? My Father is always at his work to this very day, and I too am working. For this reason, they, the Jewish leaders, tried all the more to kill Jesus. Wait a second. Why did they try to kill him? Oh, we know why. Not only because he was breaking the Sabbath by healing a guy in their mind, but he was even calling God his what? Own Father, making himself equal with God. When Jesus said, get these things out of my Father's house, what was Jesus saying about himself? I am God. And I am God the Son. I am the promised Messiah. And I have the right to define true, reverent worship. So what have we learned today? Passover. Jesus went to the Passover. Isn't it interesting? He is the Passover lamb. As John the Baptist said, who would take away sins of his people. Right? I mean, think about the picture of the lamb at the Exodus, and you think about Jesus, the true Passover lamb. God the Son, who became a man, born of a virgin, conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit, and as the perfect God-man, he fulfilled all righteousness, every law, even celebrating the Passover, even though he's the Passover lamb. I wonder when he was there in Jerusalem and heard all those lambs being slaughtered, and all that noise and that blood, I wonder if he was thinking, yeah, these sacrifices are eventually going to end, because Jesus is probably thinking, I will be the full and final Passover lamb. But I wonder, every time he heard the scream of the animals, I wonder what he thought. Because of that scream that will be on the cross. After fulfilling righteousness for us, he went to the cross to pay for our unrighteousness. And as the perfect Passover lamb, the one without defect, God the Father took our sins, the sins of his people, placed them on Jesus, and punished Jesus in our place as our substitute. Jesus died, but what happened 3 days later? Rose from the dead, overcoming sin and death for us. And through Jesus, we have forgiveness of sins. Through Jesus, we are brought into God's royal family. Through Jesus, we are set free from the bondage of sin, self, and Satan. And through Jesus, because of his precious royal blood, God's wrath will pass over us and not come on us, because we are covered by the saving blood of Christ. Jesus is the Passover lamb, right? Does he have the right to define true worship? What true prayer is? What true praise is? Christian, your body is the temple of the living God. Are there any problems he's seeing in your temple right now? Have you been turning God's house into? You can finish the sentence. When you come to celebrate the Passover lamb, are you truly here to celebrate him? When you come to give your offerings to the Lord, are you truly giving them to the Lord with a grateful heart? If you are even giving offerings. When Jesus sees you praying and praising, is it true reverent worship to him? Or is your mind racing, not focused, thinking about where you want to go afterwards, where you've been before? Remember, we all agree that only God has the right to define true worship, right? And we know that Jesus is God, so he has the right to define true worship. Are there any areas right now in your life that he needs to pull out the cord of whips and to purify you? Purify your thoughts, your words, your actions, your attitudes, your anger, your arrogance. And oh, by the way, you're just hearing the message that I've been studying and the Lord's been speaking to me for the last week. So you're going to share my pain. Does zeal for the Lord's house consume you? First, you is the temple of the living God, and the church is the temple of the living God. Do you have that zeal that the Lord is honored, that he is revered, that he is worshipped? In you as an individual Christian, as us corporately. Does the refiner and purifier have some work to do with us right now? I'm going to let you close the service. Maybe spend some time with the Lord. I think you understand the first temple cleansing by Jesus. I think you get the points. I think you see how people used religion for their own self-centered interests, and they were irreverent in their worship towards God. We don't want to be that way, do we? Spend some time now in silent prayer. Ask the Lord to show you any problem. And ask the Lord, the Passover lamb, to purify.